A Chinese memory fabricator called Changxin Memory Technologies has reached a production cost per gigabyte that independent industry analysts describe as meaningfully below what Samsung and Micron currently report in their own filings. The cost gap is real by most credible accounts, though the audited proof has not arrived. One pricing hand, two radically different ways to deploy it. The first wager is the flood. Cut the retail price below Samsung's sustainable floor, prioritize volume share in commodity memory segments, and compress the capital available to Western and South Korean incumbents for next-generation research. The second wager is the hold. Price close to parity, bank the spread as retained margin, and keep the cost gap as a latent instrument. A counter-leverage card Beijing can play if Washington tightens equipment or intellectual property controls further. What decides which wager pays is not the cost number itself, but what Beijing chooses to do with it. And the tell that resolves that question is sitting in a procurement pipeline most analysts are only now starting to watch. To lay the full wager properly, start with how the cost advantage appeared at all. Western export controls on advanced lithography equipment were designed to freeze Chinese memory producers out of the leading edge of the process roadmap. What they produced instead was a different optimization target. Rather than chasing the smallest possible node at any cost, Changxin Memory Technologies and its peers concentrated capital on competitive cost at a mature node, narrower in ambition, but leaner in overhead. The constraint redirected the capital allocation in ways the original policy did not model, and the result is a cost structure that Samsung and Micron's planning assumptions did not anticipate. That structural origin matters for pricing both wagers because a cost advantage born from a forced detour is not the same as one born from a deliberate research program. Its durability is a different kind of question. The first weighing concerns the historical analog. Every prior Chinese industrial scaling story, photovoltaics, display glass, shipbuilding, followed the flood playbook. Build ahead of demand, cut price below the incumbent's sustainable floor, take volume, and let the margin compression do the strategic work over time. Changxin Memory's domestic capacity additions are running well ahead of domestic consumption by most industry accounts, which is the physical signature of a producer building for export volume rather than margin. That pattern argues for bet A. The rebuttal is that memory is not glass. The customer qualification cycle for server and data center memory is measured in quarters, not weeks, and it involves rigorous reliability testing that a low price does not shortcut. Changxin Memory's product is moving primarily within Chinese domestic supply chains, smartphones, consumer electronics, domestic cloud infrastructure, rather than into Western data center procurement pipelines. No independent audit of its hyperscaler design win list outside China has been published. The analog to solar and steel is real, but imperfect, and the line moves slightly toward bet B on this weighing. A pure flood strategy hits a qualification ceiling faster than the solar parallel implies, and that ceiling is currently intact. The second weighing is where the pricing has to be honest about a loss, and the honest call is this. Bet B, the hold for leverage play, is the tentative lean at this stage of the evidence, but it trails its rival on one metric plainly, and the loss is priced flat here without recovery. The metric is the time value of the unspent option. A cost advantage held in reserve depreciates. Samsung and Micron are not standing still. Both are moving resources toward high bandwidth memory and advanced packaging, the segments where artificial intelligence infrastructure spending is concentrating. The per gigabyte cost gap Changxin Memory holds in commodity. Memory does not transfer automatically to those higher value segments where the architectural requirements are more demanding and the process node gap matters more. If the hold strategy runs long while the market migrates up the value stack, the window in which the cost advantage is convertible into either revenue share or diplomatic leverage narrows on its own. Bet B's option is real today. Its half-life is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty does not resolve in Bet B's favor. The line does not move back from this concession. Think of the cost gap the way a late tournament card player thinks of a chip lead. The lead constrains the opponent's aggression, even in hands that are folded, because the threat of a large bet exists whether or not it is ever made. That is Bet B's geometry. The power of the unspent advantage is real without deployment. But a chip lid that shrinks while the blinds rise is still shrinking, and Bet B is subject to exactly that pressure as the memory market shifts toward higher complexity products where the cost gap is narrower. The third weighing concerns the counter-restriction argument, the idea that if Chinese memory production reaches a meaningful share of global supply, Beijing holds a credible threat to restrict exports the way Washington restricts chip-making equipment. The logic price is correctly in theory. A supplier that controls a large enough share of global memory output can use the threat of withholding supply as genuine leverage, even if the threat is never executed. The rebuttal is that counter-restriction credibility requires actual share, not just cost parity. Global memory production remains heavily concentrated in South Korea and the United States by the most recently available independent market share tallies. Reports suggest Chinese producers collectively account for a fraction of global bit output, and no independent analyst has placed that fraction above the threshold typically described as leverage enabling. The threat is structurally available, but not yet credibly priced at full value. On this weighing, the line nudges back toward bet A for the near term because closing the share gap may be the prerequisite for bet B to work at all. The leverage option cannot price at par until the share underpinning it is large enough to cause real pain if withdrawn. The fourth weighing introduces the largest unpriced variable in the entire frame: Samsung's response function. Samsung has twice in its documented corporate history deliberately priced memory below its own cost for extended periods to discipline competitors. That strategy is recorded in antitrust filings and industry histories, not rumor, and Samsung's balance sheet is deep enough to absorb it again. If Changxin Memory floods, Samsung can flood harder. The rebuttal is that Samsung's willingness to run that playbook against a state-backed Chinese producer with nationally socialized losses is not the same calculation as running it against a private rival. When a competitor's losses can be absorbed at the national level, the cost war arithmetic changes in ways that are not yet modeled in public analysis. No Samsung public statement addresses this scenario directly. This weighing moves the line toward uncertainty rather than toward either wager, and uncertainty at the decisive variable is itself a meaningful pricing signal. At the decisive weighing, 3 reasons the tentative lean toward bet B could be wrong deserve a full accounting before the synthesis. First, Changxin Memory's cost advantage rests on a process node that independent engineers characterize as roughly 1 to 2 generations behind Samsung's leading edge. At commodity memory, that gap is manageable. In high bandwidth memory for accelerator workloads, the fastest growing segment of the market, the gap may be disqualifying regardless of price, and if the market migrates fast enough, the cost advantage is stranded in a shrinking segment. Second, the cost per gigabyte figure circulating in analyst notes traces to Changxin Memory's own disclosures and industry channel checks, not to independently verified cost accounting. The distance between a reported cost and a fully loaded cost that includes state subsidy, favorable depreciation schedules, and actual yield rates is unmeasured and potentially significant. A number that survives scrutiny at reported cost may look different after subsidy adjustment. Third, a visible price cut offensive in Western markets would likely accelerate calls for memory-specific import restrictions or tariffs in the United States and the European Union. The same political reflex applied to solar panels, steel, and electric vehicles. Bet A's payoff assumes that geopolitical response is slow or absent. It may not be. The synthesis across those 3. The cost advantage is real by most credible accounts, but its convertibility into either revenue share or durable leverage is contingent on at least 2 variables: the pace of hyperscaler qualification outside China and the speed of geopolitical response that remain genuinely open. Neither wager has closed them. 4 catalysts would move the line materially, and they deserve concrete forward pricing rather than a recap of what has already been weighed. The first catalyst is a named hyperscaler or a major original equipment manufacturer outside China announcing Changxin Memory as an approved vendor for server or data center workloads. This is the single result that most reprices the entire frame. It would mean the qualification ceiling has broken, the flood is executable at scale, and bet A's odds shorten sharply. Watch for it in procurement disclosures, supply chain filings, and vendor approval announcements from the large cloud operators. If it appears, the hold strategy becomes harder to justify because the cost advantage is suddenly deployable in the market that matters most. The second catalyst is any formal regulatory guidance from Beijing, even a draft framing domestic memory production as a strategic reserve or critical infrastructure category subject to export licensing review. This is the signal that Bet B's leverage hold framing has moved from analyst speculation into official doctrine. It would lengthen Bet A's odds and price the counter restriction option more explicitly. The place to watch is Ministry of Commerce and National Development and Reform Commission filing language, not public statements. The distinction matters. Official doctrine embedded in regulatory text is a commitment signal. A public statement is not. The third catalyst is a gross margin decline at Samsung or Micron that is steeper than their own volume mix shift explains. A margin move that implies external price pressure rather than internal product decisions would be the first observable evidence that Changxin memory pricing is already landing in markets the incumbents are defending. Incumbent margin data is more trustworthy than a shipment claim from Changxin Memory itself. If the margin signal appears in an earnings call before the procurement announcement does, Bet A may already be executing by default rather than by design, which is a different kind of signal. It means the flood is happening without Beijing having explicitly chosen it. The fourth catalyst is an independent cost audit from a neutral industry research firm, not a vendor-commissioned study, that publishes a fully loaded cost per gigabyte comparison accounting for state subsidies, depreciation schedules, and yield rates. If the audit confirms a cost gap at or near current estimates, both wagers' starting premise strengthens and the strategic choice becomes the dominant question. If the audit narrows the gap significantly after subsidy adjustment, both wagers deflate. The hand is weaker than it appeared, and the whole frame reprices downward. This document does not yet exist in the public record. It is the most important single input the market is missing, and its absence is itself a reason to hold both odds loosely. The analysts' read, priced on the evidence as it stands, sits closer to Bet B than Bet A, but only marginally, and with a shorter time horizon than the leverage hold framing implies. Changxin Memory holds a real cost advantage by most credible accounts. The qualification pipeline outside China is too thin to execute a flood at scale in the near term. The counter-restriction logic does not reach full value until Chinese memory share is materially larger than current estimates suggest. And Bet B's option depreciates at a rate that is unknown, but not zero. The constraint that was intended to freeze Chinese memory producers out of the leading edge produced instead a cost structure that Western incumbents did not model and did not plan for. The export controls closed one door, and the industry rebuilt around a different one, and the hand it is now holding was not in the original policy deck. Whether Beijing plays that hand as a market weapon or a diplomatic instrument depends on a qualification pipeline that is currently thin, a geopolitical response clock that is currently running, and a Samsung response function that is currently unpriced. The odds favor the hold at these odds for now. But a hold that runs out of time pays the same as a fold. Which wager would you back? Flood the market and take share before the qualification ceiling rises? Or hold the cost gap as leverage and wait for Washington to move first? Price it in the comments. And subscribe for the next odds update, because the catalyst that moves this line most will show up in a vendor earnings call before it shows up anywhere else.